And then comes chapter 4. And if readers were not astute enough to pick up on all of the foreshadowing that has come about, we are hit over the head with what kind of creature Count Dracula is in chapter 4. And I'm going to read some key paragraphs here. And of course, I'm not going to read the whole chapter, but I'm going to read a few key paragraphs in order to make sure that you have been astute enough to pick up on the fact that Dracula is a vampire. There, in one of the great boxes, of which there were 50 in all, on a pile of newly dug earth, lay the Count. He was either dead or asleep. I could not say which, for eyes were open and stony, but without the glassiness of death, and the cheeks had the warmth of life through all their pallor. The lips were as red as ever, but there was no sign of movement, no pulse, no breath, no beating of the heart. So you have boxes, obviously coffins, and there are 50 of them. But there is Dracula in one. Also note the newly dug earth. So if Harker doesn't know by now, this should give him a huge clue. But then later he sees the Count, and he said of him, Harker's going to his room, "The last I saw of Count Dracula was as kissing his hand to me with a red light of triumph in his eye, and with a smile that Judas in hell might be proud of." Now, the reason why I'm reading this passage to you, even though it might seem a relatively minor passage, was the reference to Judas. Because in some circles, Judas is considered one of the first vampires. But regardless of whether Judas was a vampire or not, he is not a very savory creature within the realm of mythology. And so his connection with Dracula here is interesting and perhaps a bit important. Now, it goes on, and Harker runs into the Count again in his sleeping state. "I knew I must reach the body for the key, so I raised the lid and laid it back against the wall. And then I saw something which filled my very soul with horror. There lay the Count, but looking as if his youth had been half restored, for the white hair and mustache were changed to dark iron gray. The cheeks were fuller, and the white skin seemed ruby red underneath. The mouth was redder than ever, for on the lips there were gouts of fresh blood, which trickled from the corners of the mouth and ran down over the chin and neck. Even the deep, burning eyes seemed set amongst swollen flesh, for the lids and pouches underneath were bloated. It seemed as if the whole awful creature were simply gorged with blood. He lay like a filthy leech, exhausted with his repletion. The very thought drove me mad. A terrible desire came upon me to rid the world of such a monster. At least God's mercy is better than those that of those monsters. And the precipice is steep and high. At the foot lay a man asleep as a man. Goodbye all, Mina." And so there's been some time elapsed from these paragraphs. And again, I'm just reading some that I consider important. But Harker is saying with this last paragraph, it is better to be dead than to be a vampire. Now, as we move through history and coming into modern times, that idea is not shared by quite a few people. When you get into Interview with the Vampire, Anne Rice's first novel, the person who is interviewing Lestat wants to become a vampire. And even later in Queen of the Damned, the young descendant of one of the first vampires, or one of the vampires in Egypt, in her Maharet, she's traced her great family, Maharet has, and her descendant wants Lestat to turn her into a vampire, and of course he finally does, because she's going to die if he doesn't. So you have a shift from Harker, who would rather die than become a vampire, to people who actively want to become vampires. Then in chapter 5, there's a shift from Harker back to England.